The wind that swept down from the Medicine Bow Range on the morning of December 14th carried a particular quality that old-timers would spend the rest of their lives trying to describe to those who had not felt it. At dawn, the mercury in the thermometer hanging outside the Dusty Fork General Store read 2 degrees above zero, and those who paused to check it noted how the silver thread seemed to tremble, as though the instrument itself dreaded what was coming. By 7 in the morning, the temperature had dropped another degree. By 9, it had fallen 2 more. The sky above the Wyoming Territory had taken on a color that existed nowhere in nature, except as a warning, a pale, sickly yellow-gray that pressed down upon the high plains like the lid of a coffin being slowly lowered. Dusty Fork, population 847 souls according to the most recent census conducted by the territorial government, occupied a shallow valley where 3 creeks converged before continuing their journey toward the North Platte River. The town had grown from a single trading post established in 1867 to a collection of 63 buildings arranged along 2 intersecting streets, including a church with a white steeple that Reverend Orrin Blackwood had commissioned to be built 12 feet taller than any structure within 50 miles. The steeple could be seen from the road leading in from Cheyenne, and the Reverend often reminded his congregation that it served as a beacon of civilization in the godless wilderness, a finger pointing toward heaven to remind the faithful of their ultimate destination. At noon on December 14th, the first flakes began to fall. They drifted down with a gentleness that deceived nearly everyone who watched them. Fat, lazy crystals that melted on warm skin and accumulated in thin lines along fence rails and hitching posts. Children ran out to catch them on their tongues. Young couples walking arm in arm tilted their faces toward the sky and smiled at the seasonal beauty of it all. Even Reverend Blackwood, standing on the steps of his church after the midday prayer service, pronounced the snowfall a blessing from the Almighty, a white blanket to cover the sins of the old year before the new one arrives. What none of them knew, what none of them could have known, except perhaps for one man who had been watching the elk and the rabbits and the ravens for weeks, was that this gentle snowfall marked the beginning of what survivors would later call the Great White Death. 19 consecutive days of blizzard conditions. Temperatures that would plunge to 41 degrees below zero. Wind that would kill exposed flesh in under 3 minutes. Before it ended, 7 residents of Dusty Fork would be dead, and the rest would owe their survival to the very man they had spent 18 months mocking. His name was Levi Calloway, and he had arrived in Dusty Fork in June of 1885, with the surveyor's transit strapped to his pack horse, a chestnut mare named Hickory, and knowledge that no amount of money could purchase because it had been paid for in blood and hunger generations before he was born. Levi had spent 15 years working for the Union Pacific Railroad, reading terrain from the Missouri River to the Rocky Mountains. He had learned to see what others could not, the subtle signs that indicated where bedrock lay close to the surface, where water would drain naturally and where it would pool and freeze, where the southern exposure would warm the earth and where the north-facing slopes would hold ice until July. When the railroad work dried up and the younger surveyors with their fancy new equipment began taking the contracts, Levi had collected his savings and gone looking for a place to apply his grandmother's other lessons. Bridget Calloway had been 17 years old when the potato blight struck County Mayo in 1845. Over the next 7 years, she watched 1 million of her countrymen die and another 1 million flee across the ocean. Her own parents perished in the 2nd year, and her 3 younger siblings followed within months. Bridget survived because she learned every method of preserving food when none existed. She dried meat over peat fires when there was meat to be had. She salted fish with the last grains of salt in the county. She pickled vegetables in vinegar made from wild apples, smoked whatever could be smoked, and buried root vegetables in sand-filled pits that kept them edible through the worst of the winters. These were not skills passed down through family tradition. They were innovations born of desperation, refined through terrible trial and error, each technique representing someone who had died before it was perfected. Bridget carried this knowledge across the Atlantic in 1852, across the continent to California during the gold rush, and finally to a small farm in eastern Nebraska where she raised her son and, when he was killed in a farming accident, raised her grandson Levi in his place. She taught the boy everything she knew about surviving when the world wanted you dead. She made him memorize temperatures and salt ratios and smoking times until he could recite them in his sleep. She showed him how to read the signs that nature provided for those patient enough to learn: the thickness of onion skins, the behavior of animals before storms, the smell of the air when cold was coming. In the cholera summer of 1871, Bridget fell ill while nursing neighbors who had no one else to care for them. Levi was 23 years old and already working for the railroad, but he came home when word reached him. He held his grandmother in his arms for the final 3 days of her life, listening as she repeated the old lessons through cracked lips and fever-bright eyes. Her last words were in Irish, which she had taught him as a boy despite his protests that he would never need it. Ni neart go cur le chele. There is no strength without unity. She died on a Tuesday morning in August, and Levi buried her beside his father on the Nebraska farm that he sold 3 days later because he could not bear to stay. When Levi rode into Dusty Fork 18 months before the blizzard, he was 50 years old, gray-bearded, and looking for a place to die in his own time and on his own terms. The town lot that caught his surveyor's eye was a rocky hillside plot on the eastern edge of town, a piece of land that had been offered for sale 3 times and purchased once by a man who abandoned it after 6 months of trying to farm soil that was more stone than dirt. The locals called it Callaway's Folly even before Levi began work, and they shook their heads at the madness of a man who would pay good money, $47, which was exactly 47 more than anyone else had been willing to spend, for land that could not support so much as a kitchen garden. What they did not see, because they had never learned to look, was what Levi saw. The hillside's bedrock lay close to the surface, which made farming impossible, but excavation stable. The natural slope provided drainage that would carry water away rather than letting it pool and freeze. Most importantly, the southern exposure meant that a cellar entrance cut into that hillside would receive warming sunlight for most of the winter day, keeping the access clear of the deep ice that plagued north-facing structures. Levi began digging in August of 1885. He worked alone at first, swinging a pick into the rocky soil for 12 hours a day, while hickory grazed in the small pasture he had fenced behind his modest cabin. When he hit solid bedrock at 8 feet, he hired a blasting man from Cheyenne to help him go deeper. When the blasting man declared the project the finest lunacy I have ever witnessed and charged me for, Levi thanked him, paid him, and continued digging. When the blasting man asked why any sensible person would dig a cellar 30 feet deep when 12 would serve for any practical purpose, Levi said only that he had his reasons. The work took 14 months. The total cost, which Levi recorded in a leather journal with the same precision he had once applied to railroad surveys, came to $847, a figure he found grimly amusing, as it matched exactly the population of the town that would benefit from his labors. The finished chamber extended 40 feet into the hillside and measured 12 feet wide at its broadest point. The walls were lined with mortared stone that Levi hauled from a creek bed 3 miles distant. The floor was packed earth covered with a layer of sand for drainage. The entrance was a heavy oak door fitted with iron hinges that Levi ordered specially from Denver, and above the door he carved a symbol that no one in Dusty Fork recognized, a Celtic knot that Bridget had taught him to draw when he was 5 years old. The temperature inside the completed cellar held steady at 55 degrees throughout the hottest summer days and the coldest winter nights. This was the magic that only those who understood the earth could comprehend, that below a certain depth, The temperature remained constant regardless of what the sky above was doing. Bridget had known this. Her people had known it for generations beyond counting. And now Levi knew it, and he used it. Throughout the autumn of 1886, while his neighbors worried about the coming winter in the abstract way of people who had survived previous winters and assumed all winters would be the same, Levi filled his cellar with provisions. 900 pounds of beef, smoked over applewood in a smokehouse he built himself, following Bridget's precise instructions for temperature and duration. 600 jars of preserved vegetables and fruits, pickled beans, brined cucumbers, tomatoes sealed in glass with wax, peaches swimming in honey and brandy, 80 pounds of dried beans stored in canvas sacks, 40 gallons of pickled cabbage in oak barrels, potatoes, carrots, turnips, and onions bedded in sand that kept them fresh and firm. Enough food to feed 20 souls for 4 months, arranged on shelves he had built himself and labeled in his grandmother's careful hand, which he replicated from memory because her actual handwriting had been lost when he sold the Nebraska farm. The people of Dusty Fork watched these preparations with the bemused contempt that settled communities reserve for outsiders who do not understand how things work. They watched Levi haul his smoked beef down the hillside in a handcart. They watched him preserve vegetables using methods their grandmothers had abandoned in favor of the modern canned goods available at the general store. They watched him dig a cellar deeper and deeper into the rock, and they talked. The talk began as whispers and grew into a chorus that followed Levi wherever he went in Dusty Fork. At the general store, conversations would pause when he entered and resume in lower tones when he departed. At the blacksmith's forge, where he went to purchase iron brackets for his cellar shelves, the smith's apprentice made a show of measuring Levi's hands and declaring them more suited to mole work than honest labor. The comment drew laughter from the men gathered around the forge, and Levi said nothing, simply paid for his brackets and loaded them onto hickory saddle packs. The work on the cellar continued through the autumn months with a methodical precision that Bridget would have recognized and approved. Levi had learned from his grandmother that survival was not a matter of grand gestures, but of small, repeated actions performed correctly. Each jar of preserved vegetables represented an hour of careful work. The washing, the cutting, the measuring of salt and vinegar and sugar in exact proportions that Bridget had tested and refined over decades. Each pound of smoked beef represented 3 days of controlled fire, of checking temperatures with a thermometer Levi had purchased in Cheyenne for the extravagant sum of $4.50, of turning the meat at precise intervals to ensure even exposure to the applewood smoke. In September, Levi added a second chamber to his cellar, branching off from the main room at a 90-degree angle. This extension cost him an additional $112 in blasting powder and hired labor, bringing his total expenditure to $959. The new chamber measured 20 feet deep and 8 feet wide, and he lined its walls with the same mortared stone that protected the main room. When the general store owner, a thin man named Horace Pemberry, who had refused Levi credit since his arrival, asked what possible purpose such an expansion could serve, Levi replied simply that he intended to store grain. "Grain," Pemberry repeated, his voice carrying the particular tone of a man addressing an idiot. "You are digging a mine to store grain." "Not a mine," Levi said. "A cellar." "A cellar," Pemberry said, "is 6 feet deep, 8 at most. What you are building, Mr. Calloway, is a hole to nowhere." Levi purchased his grain from a supplier in Cheyenne, who shipped it by rail to the nearest depot, 23 miles distant. 300 pounds of wheat, 200 pounds of oats, 150 pounds of dried corn. He hauled each sack down into his cellar on his own back, making trip after trip while the autumn sun painted the Wyoming hills in shades of gold and russet. The work left him exhausted each evening, but it was the good exhaustion of a body used for its proper purpose. If you want to hear more tales of frontier resilience and communities tested by nature, check out our other videos where ordinary people faced extraordinary challenges, and do not forget to subscribe for stories like this every week. It was Reverend Orrin Blackwood who elevated the mockery from casual contempt to organized scorn. The Reverend was a tall man with a voice that had been trained to fill large spaces, and he used that voice from his pulpit on the second Sunday of October to address what he called the troubling spectacle of misguided labor occurring on the eastern edge of town. "Brothers and sisters," the Reverend intoned, his words rolling out over the congregation like thunder across the plains, "we are called to build toward heaven. We raise our steeples high. We lift our eyes to the Lord. We aspire to that which is above us, not that which is below." He paused, allowing his gaze to sweep across the assembled faithful. "Yet there is one among us who digs ever downward, who burrows into the earth like a creature that fears the light. The mole man builds his kingdom in darkness while godly men build toward the sun." The congregation shifted in their pews. Some glanced toward the door, as though expecting Levi to appear and defend himself, though he had never attended services at the Dusty Fork Church and showed no inclination to begin. "Perhaps," the Reverend continued, warming to his theme, "he expects to meet his Maker coming up from below. Perhaps he believes that salvation lies not in heaven, but in the cold embrace of the grave. I say to you, brothers and sisters, that such thinking is not merely foolish. It is impious. It is a rejection of the natural order that God has established for his children." The phrase "mole man" entered the vocabulary of Dusty Fork that very afternoon. By supper, half the town was using it. By the following morning, it had become Levi's unofficial title, spoken with varying degrees of contempt and amusement depending on the speaker. Children who had never met him used it as a taunt, chanting mole man, digging in the dirt," when they passed his property on their way to the schoolhouse. Their parents did nothing to discourage them. Martha Blackwood, the Reverend's wife, organized the exclusion with the quiet efficiency of a woman accustomed to managing social affairs. She was a small woman with sharp eyes and a talent for making her opinions known without ever stating them directly. When the ladies of the church formed their winter quilting circle in late October, Martha let it be known that Levi Calloway would not be welcome at any gathering held in her home. When the Christmas Social Committee convened to plan the annual celebration, she suggested, merely suggested of course, that certain elements of the community might not share the committee's values and should therefore be excused from participation. The message spread through channels that men rarely witnessed but always felt. Levi found that the seamstress who had been happy to repair his shirts in September was too busy in October. The widow who sold eggs from her small flock suddenly had none to spare when he came calling. The young men who had occasionally helped him haul stone for a fair day's wage began finding other employment. Sarah Pembury, wife of the general store owner, delivered what she clearly considered the decisive blow during a gathering of women at the church on the last Saturday of October. Levi learned of it only because the blacksmith's wife, who had always treated him with cool civility rather than open hostility, mentioned it in passing when he came to collect a repaired harness. "She said you were digging your own grave," the blacksmith's wife reported, not meeting his eyes. "Said anyone fool enough to dig 30 feet down was clearly preparing for his own burial. Said the town ought to start taking bets on whether you would finish the hole before winter finished you." Levi accepted this information with the same expression he showed to all the town's judgments, a face as still and weathered as the hillside he had chosen to make his home. He thanked the blacksmith's wife for her honesty, paid for his harness, and led Hickory back toward his property on the eastern edge of town. That evening, as the sun painted the Medicine Bow Range in shades of pink and gold, Levi stood beside Hickory in the small pasture behind his cabin and spoke aloud for the first time in days. The mare turned her head toward him, her dark eyes reflecting the dying light. "They have decided I am mad, old girl." Levi ran his hand along Hickory's neck, feeling the warmth of her beneath his calloused palm. Mad or foolish or impious, depending on who is doing the deciding. The Reverend thinks I am burrowing toward hell. Pemberry thinks I am wasting money I could be spending in his store. The women think I am preparing my own funeral. Hickory nickered softly and pushed her nose against his chest. "Let them build their steeples," Levi said, and his voice took on a quality that he rarely allowed others to hear. A weariness that went bone deep, mixed with something that might have been grief for a grandmother 3 decades dead and something else that might have been fear. Grandmother Bridget knew, you cannot eat pride, and you cannot burn righteousness for warmth. He stood in silence for a long moment, watching the shadows lengthen across the valley where Dusty Fork nestled like a child, unaware of the wolf approaching through the darkness. "The elk came down from the high country 3 weeks early," he said finally, speaking to Hickory but also to the empty air, to the ghost of his grandmother, to whoever might be listening in that vast and indifferent landscape. "I saw them crossing the ridge above Patterson's claim, a herd of 40 at least, moving fast, not stopping to graze. The rabbits are wearing coats I have never seen this thick, this early. Their fur is so dense you could lose your fingers in it." Hickory stamped one hoof and tossed her head. "And the ravens." Levi's voice dropped lower, as though he feared being overheard even here, even by no one. "There were 100 ravens roosting in the cottonwoods by the creek when I arrived. 100 at least, maybe more. Loud and argumentative, the way ravens are. I have not seen one in 2 weeks. Not one. They have gone somewhere, and they are not coming back." He thought of the feed store 3 days prior, when he had mentioned the ravens to the men gathered around the pot-bellied stove. The Reverend had been among them, warming his hands and expounding upon the weather as a manifestation of divine will. "The beasts of the field follow God's plan," the Reverend had said when Levi voiced his observations, "not the superstitions of mole men." The laughter had been immediate and general. Even the feed store owner, a man named Carlton who had always treated Levi with reasonable fairness, had smiled at the jest. Levi had left without completing his purchase. He had what he needed. He had more than enough. Now standing beside Hickory in the gathering dusk, he spoke the truth he had not dared speak to any human soul in Dusty Fork. "Something is coming, old girl. Something bad. Worse than anything these people have seen, worse than anything they can imagine." He rested his forehead against Hickory's warm neck, and when it comes, they will remember every word they said about the mole man. They will remember, and they will understand. But by then, it may be too late for understanding to matter. In early December, a false spring descended upon the high plains. The temperature rose to nearly 50 degrees for 3 consecutive days, and the snow that had accumulated in early November melted into muddy rivulets that ran through the streets of Dusty Fork like promises of an easy winter. The residents emerged from their homes with relieved smiles, congratulating themselves on their good fortune. The Reverend preached a sermon of thanksgiving, crediting the mild weather to the town's collective piety and suggesting that the Lord was rewarding his faithful servants with a gentle season. Levi watched the false spring with mounting dread. He had seen this pattern before in Nebraska and on the high plains during his surveying years. A sudden warming before a great storm was not a blessing. It was a lure, a trap, nature's way of drawing creatures out of their dens before the killing blow fell. The warmth itself was a warning that the coming cold would be proportionally severe, as though the weather needed to build a greater contrast to make its point. On the morning of December 10th, Levi walked the perimeter of his property and noted that the ground, which had softened during the warm spell, was beginning to freeze again with unusual speed. The mud that had been ankle-deep the previous day was now crusted with ice thick enough to bear his weight. By afternoon, the crust had grown to nearly an inch. By evening, the temperature had dropped 20 degrees, and the stars overhead burned with a cold intensity that seemed to pierce the sky itself. The beaver dam on Miller Creek, which Levi had been monitoring since October, stood 3 feet higher than any dam he had observed in his 15 years of surveying. Beavers built their dams high when they expected deep water from heavy snow. It was not superstition. It was practical knowledge, the accumulated wisdom of creatures that had survived 1,000 winters and would survive 1,000 more. For those of you who love stories about reading nature's warnings, drop a comment below with the animal signs your grandparents taught you to watch for, and share this video with someone who appreciates old wisdom. On December 11th, Levi made his final preparations. He checked each jar of preserves, each barrel of pickled vegetables, each sack of grain and beans. He counted the smoked beef portions and confirmed that his calculations remained accurate. 20 souls fed for 4 months, or a larger number for a shorter duration if the emergency demanded it. He stacked additional firewood in the sheltered corner of his cellar where it would remain dry regardless of what fell from the sky. He filled every container he owned with water from the well, knowing that the well itself might freeze or become inaccessible. On December 12th, he led Hickory down the steep path into the cellar's second chamber. The grain storage area he had excavated at such expense. The mare went willingly, trusting him as she had trusted him through all the years they had traveled together. He had laid fresh straw in the chamber and hung 2 lanterns from iron hooks set into the mortared stone. The space was not comfortable for a horse, but it was survivable. Hickory would not freeze to death in his cellar, whatever else might happen. On December 13th, Levi did something he had not done since his arrival in Dusty Fork. He walked into town and attempted to warn his neighbors. He began at the general store, where Horace Pembury was arranging canned goods on his shelves with the satisfied air of a man whose inventory would sell briskly in the coming weeks. "There is a storm coming," Levi said without preamble. "A bad one. Worse than anything you have seen. You should stock extra provisions. Tell your customers to do the same." Pembury did not turn around. "The weather has been mild, Mr. Calloway. The Reverend himself has declared it a blessed season. The Reverend does not read the signs that matter. The elk have descended. The ravens have fled. The beavers have built their dams 3 feet higher than normal. These are not superstitions. These are observations. The animals know what is coming." Now Pembury turned, and his face wore an expression of patient contempt. The animals. Of course, the mole man speaks for the beasts of the field, since he has chosen to live among them rather than among civilized men. Tell me, Mr. Calloway, do the earthworms whisper prophecies to you as you dig? Do the grubs share their visions of the future? Levi felt the familiar weariness settle over him. He had known this would happen. He had known, and he had come anyway, because Bridget had raised him to try, even when trying was hopeless. "You should have provisions for at least 3 weeks," he said. "More, if possible. Coal, firewood, food that will not spoil, water stored against the well freezing. I'm telling you this because you have a wife and children, and I do not wish to see them suffer for your pride." Something flickered in Pembury's eyes. Not fear, exactly, but something that might have been the first cousin of uncertainty. Then it vanished, replaced by the cold dismissal that Levi had come to expect from the people of Dusty Fork. "Good day, Mr. Calloway. I trust you can find your way out." Levi made the same attempt at 3 more establishments: the livery stable, the boarding house, and finally the church, where Reverend Blackwood received him with a smile that contained no warmth whatsoever. "The mole man emerges from his burrow to prophesy doom," the Reverend said, spreading his hands in a gesture that encompassed his modest office and, by extension, the entire community he served. How unexpected! How delightfully predictable! Tell me, Mr. Calloway, is this doom to arrive before or after Christmas? I should like to adjust my sermon schedule accordingly. Before, Levi said flatly, within days, perhaps hours. Remarkable precision for a prophecy based on animal behavior. The ravens have fled, you say? Perhaps they simply found better pickings elsewhere. The elk have descended? They do that every winter, Mr. Calloway. It is what elk do. Not 3 weeks early, not moving as fast as I saw them move. The Reverend leaned back in his chair, his expression settling into something that might have been pity if there had been any genuine feeling behind it. Let me offer you some advice, Mr. Calloway. Free of charge, unlike the dubious wisdom you're attempting to peddle. The people of this community have survived many winters. They have done so by trusting in the Lord and in each other, not in the superstitious readings of a man who has chosen to isolate himself from Christian fellowship. When your prophecy fails to materialize, as it surely will, you may find that your standing in this community has fallen even lower than its present diminished state. I would recommend silence on this matter going forward. Levi stood motionless for a long moment, looking at the man who would later stand before his congregation and beg forgiveness with tears on his weathered face. I have said what I came to say, Levi replied finally. What you do with it is your concern. He left the church and walked back to his property on the eastern edge of town, where Hickory waited in her underground chamber and 900 pounds of smoked beef hung from hooks in the constant 55-degree air of his cellar. He had done what he could. He had warned them. Bridget would have understood. You could not force people to prepare for disasters they refused to believe were coming. You could only prepare yourself and hope that when the worst arrived, there would be something left to save. On the morning of December 14th, Levi rose before dawn and climbed the ridge above his property to watch the sun come up over the Medicine Bow Range. The thermometer outside his cabin read 2 degrees above zero. The sky had taken on that peculiar yellow-gray color that he remembered from the worst storms of his surveying years. The air itself seemed to be holding its breath. At noon, the first flakes began to fall. Fat, gentle, deceptive crystals that melted on warm skin and accumulated in thin lines along fence rails and hitching posts. From his vantage point on the ridge, Levi watched the children of Dusty Fork run out to catch snowflakes on their tongues. He watched the young couples tilt their faces toward the sky and smile. He watched the Reverend stand on the steps of his church and pronounce the snowfall a blessing from the Almighty. And Levi Calloway, the mole man of Dusty Fork, descended into his cellar and closed the heavy oak door behind him, leaving only the Celtic knot his grandmother had taught him carved into the wood above, a symbol of unity in a town that had shown him none, a promise of strength that would soon be tested beyond anything these people could imagine. Stay tuned for the next part of this incredible story, where the true power of preparation meets the ultimate test of nature's fury, and hit that notification bell so you do not miss a moment. The wind began at sunset. It came down from the mountains like a living thing, a predator that had been stalking the high plains for days and had finally decided to attack. Within an hour, the gentle snowfall had transformed into a horizontal assault of ice and wind that turned the air itself into a weapon. Within 2 hours, the temperature had dropped 15 degrees. Within 3, the blizzard had claimed its first victim, a draft horse left tied outside the livery stable, frozen where it stood because its owner had assumed the weather would not worsen. The Great White Death had arrived in Dusty Fork, and it was just getting started. The wind did not howl. That word implied something natural, something that belonged to the order of things. What came down from the Medicine Bow Range on the evening of December 14th was not wind, but violence made manifest, an assault that stripped the very notion of shelter from the vocabulary of Dusty Fork. The draft horse frozen at the livery stable was only the first casualty of a siege that would last 19 days, and claim 7 souls before it finished its terrible work. By midnight of that first night, the temperature had plummeted to 18 degrees below zero. The snow fell not from above, but from everywhere at once, driven sideways by gusts that reached 60 miles per hour, finding every crack in every wall, every gap beneath every door, every weakness in every structure built by hands that had never known true winter. The cold was not merely uncomfortable. It was predatory. It hunted for exposed flesh, for inadequate clothing, for insufficient fuel. It found what it sought in abundance. Levi remained in his cellar where the temperature held steady at 55 degrees regardless of what raged above. He had brought Hickory down 3 days prior, and the mare stood in the second chamber he had blasted from the hillside the previous summer, munching contentedly on the oats he had stored in sealed barrels. The chamber smelled of horse and dried corn, and the faint sweetness of applewood smoke from the beef hanging overhead. Above the heavy oak door, snow piled in drifts that would eventually reach 12 feet, but Levi had designed the entrance with a vestibule that prevented blockage of the door itself. The Celtic knot carved above remained visible only in memory now, buried beneath white death. If you are enjoying this journey through history, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and drop a comment below about your own family's survival stories. Every tradition passed down carries wisdom worth preserving. On December 15th, the wind continued without pause. The thermometer outside Levi's buried entrance, had anyone been able to read it, registered 23 degrees below zero. The snow accumulation reached 4 feet in low areas, 8 feet where drifts piled against buildings. The livery stable, weakened by the frozen horse still standing at its post like some macabre monument, groaned under the weight of ice and finally surrendered its eastern wall to the relentless pressure. 6 horses died when the structure collapsed inward, including the matched pair of bays that belonged to Horace Pembry, valued at $300 and now worth nothing more than frozen meat that no one could reach. The general store held. Horace had built it solidly, investing in the exterior rather than the foundation, in the facade rather than the stores within. But what good was a standing building when its shelves held only what its owner had deemed sufficient for a normal winter? The beans ran out by December 17th, the flour by December 19th. The salt pork, which Horace had ordered in quantities he considered generous, disappeared by December 20th, sold at prices that climbed daily as desperation mounted. $2 a pound became $4, became $8, became whatever a family could offer, and still the blizzard continued. Reverend Blackwood fared no better. His church, with its steeple reaching 12 feet higher than any structure within 50 miles, caught the wind like a sail catches the sea. On December 16th, the stained glass window depicting the Ascension, commissioned from an artisan in Denver at a cost of $275, shattered inward as a gust found the precise angle of weakness. Snow flooded the sanctuary, covering the pews where Blackwood had preached about mole men burrowing toward perdition. The Reverend and his wife Martha retreated to the parsonage, where their coal supply dwindled and their cellar, dug to the standard depth of 12 feet, began seeping groundwater as the frozen earth above it shifted and cracked. The provisions in that shallow cellar spoiled within days. The potatoes froze when the water rose. The preserved vegetables in their jars cracked as ice expanded within them. The flour went damp and then moldy. Everything the Blackwoods had stored for winter became useless, contaminated, inedible. Martha watched her husband's face as each loss registered, watched the confidence drain from his eyes like water through a cracked vessel. On December 18th, the temperature reached its nadir for that week, 34 degrees below zero. The air itself became painful to breathe. Exposed skin froze in seconds. The snow had stopped falling by then, but the wind continued its assault, rearranging drifts into new configurations of misery, blocking doors that had been cleared hours before, creating false surfaces that looked solid, but gave way under weight. Young Thomas Whelan died that day. The boy was 7 years old, with hair the color of winter wheat and a gap between his front teeth that made his smile memorable. His dog, a mongrel named Patches, who had been Thomas's constant companion since the child could walk, had wandered from the Whelan homestead during a brief lull in the wind. Thomas, who loved that dog with the uncomplicated devotion that only children and animals share, slipped out the kitchen door while his mother's back was turned. They found him 3 hours later curled around Patches in a snowdrift 200 yards from home. The dog was still alive, barely, having survived by sharing the warmth of the boy who had come to save him. Thomas Whelan was frozen solid, his small arms locked around his companion, his face peaceful in a way that suggested he had simply fallen asleep while waiting for the storm to pass. His mother's screams when they brought him home could be heard even over the wind, a sound that would haunt Dusty Fork for generations. Patches survived. The Whelans could not bear to look at him. He wandered the town for the remainder of the blizzard searching for the boy who was no longer there to find until someone, no one ever admitted who, took mercy and gave the animal shelter. Widow Carver died on Christmas Eve. She was 73 years old, a woman who had come west with her husband in the first wave of settlement, who had buried him in the plot behind their cabin 15 years prior, who had refused to leave the land they had worked together even when her children begged her to join them in California. Her coal ran out on December 23rd. She burned furniture on December 24th. She ran out of furniture by nightfall. A neighbor found her on Christmas morning sitting upright in her bed with her husband's photograph clutched to her chest, frozen in an attitude of prayer. The neighbor reported that she looked peaceful, that her face bore no signs of suffering, that she might have been sleeping if not for the frost on her eyelashes. But the neighbor also reported that the cabin was cold enough to preserve meat, that his breath hung visible in the air as he stood over her body, that he had never felt so alone in his life as he did in that moment, standing in a dead woman's home while the wind screamed outside like something damned. Make sure to hit that notification bell so you do not miss the next chapter in this remarkable tale of survival against impossible odds. The church roof collapsed on December 28th. Reverend Blackwood had been attempting to salvage what he could from the sanctuary, working in brief forays between wind gusts when the accumulated weight of snow and ice finally exceeded what the rafters could bear. He heard the groan of tortured wood, felt the floor shudder beneath his feet, and ran for the door with seconds to spare. Behind him, the steeple that had reached higher than any structure within 50 miles tilted, cracked, and fell inward upon itself, crushing the altar where Blackwood had pronounced judgment on the mole man who burrowed while godly men built toward heaven. Blackwood stood in the snow, hatless, coatless, watching his church destroy itself, and something in his face changed. The certainty that had been his armor for decades cracked like the ice that had brought down his steeple. He thought of the man he had mocked from that pulpit, the man with the ridiculous cellar and the grandmother's superstitions, the man who had tried to warn them and been dismissed with laughter. Where was Levi Calloway now? The question burned in Blackwood's mind as he staggered back to the parsonage, where Martha waited with fear in her eyes and empty shelves behind her. Where was the mole man while Dusty Fork froze and starved and buried its children in snowdrifts? In his cellar, the answer came. In his ridiculous, impossible, salvational cellar, with his 900 pounds of smoked beef and his 600 jars of preserved vegetables, and his horse eating oats from sealed barrels while the rest of them gnawed on boot leather and melted snow for drinking water. The gathering desperation drove prices beyond reason. Horace Pembury, whose matched bays lay dead in the collapsed livery stable, whose shelves grew emptier by the hour, began accepting jewelry and deeds and promissory notes in exchange for whatever scraps remained. A pound of flour for a wedding ring, a jar of pickled cabbage for the title to a quarter section of land. The transactions were legal, technically, but they carried the stench of predation, of a man feeding on his neighbor's misery. By the end of December, 43 souls in Dusty Fork faced imminent starvation. The children no longer ran out to catch snowflakes. They lay in their beds, conserving energy they no longer possessed, staring at ceilings while their parents whispered desperate prayers to a God who seemed to have turned his face away. The animals that remained alive were too valuable to slaughter. Without horses and oxen, spring planting would be impossible. But some families faced the terrible calculus of watching their children starve or eating their future. And still the blizzard continued. January 1st brought no celebration. The temperature rose slightly to a mere 12 degrees below zero, but the wind persisted. January 2nd finally saw the storm begin to weaken, the gusts spacing themselves farther apart, the snow falling more gently as if exhausted by its own violence. By January 3rd, the sky began to clear, revealing a landscape transformed beyond recognition. Drifts reached 30 feet in places. Buildings were buried to their rooftops. The main street of Dusty Fork had become a canyon between walls of white, passable only because desperate hands had dug trenches through the accumulation. 7 souls had died in 19 days, and dozens more tottered on the edge, weakened by cold and hunger and the crushing weight of helplessness. But on the morning of January 4th, a thin trail of smoke rose from the hillside lot that everyone called Calloway's Folly. Martha Blackwood saw it first. She had climbed to the second floor of the parsonage, seeking some vantage point from which to assess the damage, and her eyes caught the gray thread rising from what should have been a buried ruin. The smoke meant fire. Fire meant warmth. Warmth meant life. She did not consult her husband. She did not seek permission or company or the approval of the social committee she had once organized against the man who lived in that hole in the ground. She simply put on every piece of clothing she owned, wrapped a scarf around her face until only her eyes showed, and began the trek across town toward the eastern edge where Levi Calloway had built his impossible refuge. The journey took 2 hours through snow that reached her chest in places. She fell twice, once into a drift that nearly swallowed her entirely, and both times she pulled herself out with the desperate strength of a woman who had watched her community die around her while a man they had mocked held the keys to survival. By the time she reached the hillside, her fingers were numb, and her face burned with cold, and she could no longer feel her feet inside her boots. The vestibule entrance was clear, as if someone had been maintaining it throughout the storm. Martha descended the stone steps and knocked on the heavy oak door with hands that could barely close into fists. The door opened. Levi Calloway stood in the entrance, his gray beard trimmed and his eyes clear, and his face showing no evidence of the 19 days of horror that had aged everyone else in Dusty Fork by years. Behind him, Martha could see warmth and light and the gleaming rows of jars that lined the walls, could smell smoked meat and dried herbs and the clean scent of hay and horse. "Mrs. Blackwood," Levi said. His voice was calm, unsurprised, as if he had been expecting this visit for weeks. Perhaps he had. "Mr. Calloway." Martha's voice cracked on the words. Whether from cold or emotion, she could not tell. "The town is starving. Children are dying. We have nothing left." Levi stepped aside, revealing the full scope of his provisions, the abundance that he had prepared while they had laughed at his methods and excluded him from their society and called him names from the pulpit. "Come inside," he said simply. "Warm yourself. Then you can tell me how many souls need feeding." Martha Blackwood crossed the threshold into the cellar that would save Dusty Fork, and as the warmth enveloped her frozen body, she began to weep. The next several hours unfolded with the methodical precision that characterized everything Levi Calloway did. He listened to Martha's account of who had survived and who had not, of what provisions remained in town and which families were in most desperate need. He asked questions about the children, about the elderly, about those who were sick or injured. He made notes in a small leather journal with a pencil that his grandmother had given him 40 years prior. And then, with Martha's help, he began the work of salvation. They started with the most vulnerable. Levi loaded a sled with smoked beef, preserved vegetables, and dried beans, and Martha led him through the snow canyons of Dusty Fork to the homes where children lay weak with hunger. At each stop, Levi did not simply deliver food. He taught. He explained how to ration, how to stretch provisions, how to prepare meals that would provide maximum nutrition with minimum waste. He shared Bridget's wisdom with people who had once called him mad for following it. If this story of survival and redemption is moving you, consider supporting the channel by liking this video and sharing it with someone who needs to hear that preparation and forgiveness can change everything. The distribution took 3 days. By the end, every family in Dusty Fork had received something from the cellar that had been built for exactly this purpose. Levi kept careful records of what was given to whom, not for the purpose of collecting debts, but for the purpose of ensuring equity. Every soul received according to their need. None were turned away. None were required to apologize or beg or acknowledge that they had been wrong to mock the man who now fed them. The teaching sessions began that same week. Levi gathered those who were willing, and by now, nearly everyone was willing, in the warmth of his cellar, where the temperature held steady at 55 degrees and the walls gleamed with Bridget's legacy. He taught canning techniques, smoking methods, the art of reading weather signs in elk behavior and raven disappearances. He taught them about soil drainage and cellar depth and the importance of planning for the worst while hoping for the best. He taught them, in short, everything his grandmother had taught him in the years before the cholera summer of 1871 claimed her life. And when the teaching was finished, when bellies were full and warmth had returned to frozen limbs, the people of Dusty Fork began to speak of a gathering, a reckoning, a moment when wrongs would be acknowledged and a new chapter would begin. That gathering would come in March, when the snow began to melt and the world remembered that it knew colors beyond white and gray. But for now, in the frozen heart of January, what mattered was simpler and more profound. They lived. Because one man had dug deeper than they thought necessary, had stored more than they deemed reasonable, had listened to the wisdom of a dead grandmother while they listened to the promises of a preacher who built steeples toward a heaven that had abandoned them to the cold. They lived, and they would remember. The gathering came in March. The snow had begun its slow retreat by the middle of the month, revealing a landscape scarred by the great white death in ways that would take years to fully heal. Buildings that had seemed sturdy enough for any weather stood with cracked foundations and buckled walls. Fences had disappeared entirely, their posts snapped by the weight of drifts that had pressed against them for 19 days. The cemetery on the hill above town held 7 new graves, dug with tremendous difficulty through frozen earth that resisted every blow of the shovel. Young Thomas Whelan lay beside his father, who had died in a mining accident 3 years prior. Widow Carver rested next to her husband, reunited at last after 15 years apart. The other 5 graves held souls whose names would be spoken at the gathering, whose deaths would be acknowledged as part of the terrible accounting that the blizzard had demanded. The church where the gathering was held had been rebuilt with astonishing speed. Nearly every able-bodied person in Dusty Fork had contributed labor, working through the cold February days to raise new walls and a new roof on the foundation that had survived. The steeple was gone. That 12-foot monument to Reverend Blackwood's pride reduced to kindling that had warmed several families during the worst of the storm. In its place stood a simple wooden cross, unpainted and unadorned, that rose perhaps 6 feet above the roofline. No one had suggested rebuilding the steeple. No one had needed to explain why. The The pews were filled to capacity when Levi Calloway entered through the rear door. He had not wanted to come at all. Teaching in his cellar was one thing, practical knowledge shared in a practical setting, the continuation of Bridget's legacy in the manner she would have approved. But this gathering felt different. It felt like spectacle, like theater, and Levi had spent his entire life avoiding such things. He had come only because Martha Blackwood had appeared at his cellar door 3 days prior and asked him directly, and because something in her eyes told him that the town needed this moment even if he did not. He took a seat in the back row, beside the door, where he could leave if the proceedings became unbearable. Reverend Blackwood rose from the front pew and walked to the pulpit that had been salvaged from the collapsed church and repaired with wood from Levi's cellar. The congregation fell silent, every eye fixed upon the man who had led them in mockery and would now lead them in something altogether different. "We have gathered here," the Reverend began, and his voice cracked on the third word, "to speak truths that should have been spoken long ago, to acknowledge wrongs that cannot be undone, to ask forgiveness that may not be granted." He paused, gripping the edges of the pulpit with hands that trembled visibly. "I will speak first, because I sinned first. And I will speak loudest, because I sinned most gravely." He turned toward the back of the church, toward Levi, and when their eyes met, the Reverend's composure broke entirely. Tears streamed down his weathered face, cutting channels through skin that had been aged by cold and shame and sleepless nights. "I called you the Mole Man," Reverend Blackwood said, his voice raw. "I stood in this very pulpit, or the one it replaced, and I said that you burrowed while godly men built toward heaven. I asked my congregation if you expected to meet your Maker coming up from below. I made them laugh at you. I encouraged their contempt. I used the authority of my office to turn Christian souls against a man whose only crime was preparing for hardship while we prepared for nothing." He paused, struggling to control himself. The congregation sat in absolute silence. "When the storm came," he continued, "I watched everything I had built collapse. Not just the steeple, though that fell first and taught me nothing. My provisions spoiled in a flooded cellar while your provisions sat safe and sound 30 feet below the frost line. My matched bays froze in their stable while your mare stood warm in a chamber carved from living rock. My congregation starved while you fed them from stores I had mocked you for gathering." His voice dropped to barely a whisper. "I watched Martha walk across town to beg food from the man I had called ungodly, and I did not stop her because I knew she was right and I was wrong, and everything I had built toward heaven had come crashing down around my ears." The Reverend stepped out from behind the pulpit and walked down the center aisle toward Levi. Every head turned to follow him. He stopped 3 feet from the back pew and dropped to his knees on the wooden floor. "You saved 43 souls, Mr. Calloway, including my wife, including myself, though I deserved saving least of all." His voice broke completely. "I am begging your forgiveness. I do not deserve it. I have no right to ask for it. But I am asking nonetheless, because I do not know what else to do with the shame that I carry." He remained on his knees, head bowed, waiting. Levi said nothing. He looked at the broken man before him, and he thought of Bridget, and he remained silent. After a long moment, Reverend Blackwood rose unsteadily and returned to his seat. Horace Pembury stood next. If you're finding wisdom in this tale of humility and redemption, take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss stories that remind us how pride goes before a fall and grace comes after. The general store owner was a thin man made thinner by the weeks of privation, his expensive suit hanging loose on a frame that had lost 20 pounds since December. He did not approach the pulpit. He stood in the aisle, facing Levi directly. "I refused you credit," Horace said. His voice was flat, stripped of all pretense. "You came to my store in good faith, and I turned you away because my wife said you were not respectable, and I was too much a coward to disagree with her. I charged your neighbors 3 times the normal price for flour during the blizzard because I thought scarcity meant I could squeeze profit from desperation." He swallowed hard. "I watched children grow hollow-cheeked, and I did not lower my prices. I watched them eat the smoked beef you gave freely while I hoarded sacks of grain that would have fed half the town. And when my own stores ran out, when my own children cried from hunger, you fed them anyway. You asked no price. You demanded no apology. You simply gave." He stopped, unable to continue for a moment. His wife Sarah sat rigid in the pew beside their children, her face white with something beyond shame. "I do not know how to make right what I did wrong," Horace said finally, "but I am asking you to forgive me for the man I was, even though I do not yet know how to become the man I should be." He sat down. His wife did not look at him. Martha Blackwood rose next. She walked to the front of the church with the quiet dignity of a woman who had been stripped of illusions and found something stronger beneath them. "I organized the Christmas social committee that excluded you," she said, her voice steady. "I told the other women that a man who lived in a hole in the ground was not fit company for decent Christian folk. I laughed at my husband's jokes about the mole man. I repeated them at quilting circles. I made certain you knew that you were not welcome in our society." She turned to face the congregation as well as Levi, including them all in her confession. "And when the storm came, I was the first to go begging at your door. I walked through snow that nearly killed me to ask for food from a man I had helped to shun. You let me in. You warmed me. You gave without question or condition. And when I told you how many souls needed feeding, you did not ask first whether any of them had treated you kindly." Her voice finally wavered. "You simply asked how many, and you began to work." She met Levi's eyes directly. "I am asking your forgiveness, Mr. Calloway, not because I deserve it, I know I do not, but because I need to say the words out loud. I need the town to hear me acknowledge what I did and what you did and how vastly different they were." She returned to her seat. Carlton, the feed store owner, spoke next. He was a large man with a ruddy face now pale and drawn, and his voice shook as he recounted how he had laughed at Levi's warnings about the elk and the ravens and the coming cold, how he had repeated the Reverend's mockery to traveling salesmen, how his own children had been among the first Levi fed when the provisions ran out. And then others rose. One by one, smaller voices joined the accounting. The blacksmith who had refused to repair Levi's tools, the schoolteacher who had warned children not to play near the hillside where the strange man lived, the widow who had crossed to the other side of the street when she saw Levi coming. Each followed the same pattern: confession of wrong, description of suffering, acknowledgement of salvation, plea for forgiveness. Through it all, Levi sat in the back pew and said nothing. His face remained impassive. His hands rested on his knees. Only someone watching very closely would have noticed that his fingers occasionally moved, rubbing the smooth wood of the pew in a gesture that might have been anxiety, or might have been prayer, or might have been the unconscious motion of a man who had spent too many years with no one to talk to but a horse. Finally, when the last confessor had spoken and returned to their seat, the church fell silent. Every eye turned to Levi Calloway, waiting for the response that would determine whether forgiveness was possible, whether redemption could be granted, whether the wounds of mockery and exclusion could ever truly heal. Levi rose slowly. He did not approach the pulpit. He did not walk down the aisle. He simply stood in the back of the church and spoke, and though his voice was not loud, it carried to every corner of the rebuilt sanctuary. "My grandmother Bridget used to say that hunger teaches and plenty forgets," he began. "She learned this in County Mayo, watching a million of her countrymen die because no one had prepared for famine in times of feast. She carried that lesson across the Atlantic, across the continent, and into my keeping before the cholera summer of 1871 claimed her life. Everything I built on that hillside, everything I stored in that cellar, I built and stored, because Bridget taught me that the time to dig a well is not when you are dying of thirst. He paused, and in the silence the weight of 100 years of accumulated wisdom pressed down upon the congregation. "You have asked my forgiveness," Levi continued. "Several of you, one after another, seeking absolution as though I were a priest, and this were a confessional. But I am not a priest. I am a surveyor and a student of my grandmother's teachings, nothing more, and the forgiveness you seek is not mine to grant." A murmur rippled through the congregation. Reverend Blackwood's face went gray. "What I mean," Levi said, "is that the wrong you did was not against me. I lost nothing by your mockery. My cellar was full regardless of what names you called me. My provisions were sufficient whether or not I was welcome at your Christmas social. The wrong you did was against yourselves, against your own future selves, who would suffer for your present scorn. You mocked preparation, and you paid the price. You excluded wisdom, and wisdom excluded you in return. The debt you owe is not to Levi Calloway. The debt you owe is to the 7 souls buried on that hill, who might have lived if you had listened instead of laughed." The silence in the church had become absolute. Even the children held their breath. "But my grandmother also taught me something else," Levi said, and his voice softened just slightly. "She taught me that knowledge hoarded is knowledge lost. She taught me that survival means nothing if it ends with one's own life, that the measure of a person is what they pass on, rather than what they accumulate. She survived the famine so that she could teach my father. My father died before he could teach me, so she taught me directly. And now I have no children, no family, no one to carry Bridget's wisdom forward into the generations that will face their own blizzards and famines and catastrophes." He looked around the church, meeting eyes that had once looked away when he passed. "You have asked for forgiveness. I cannot grant what is not mine to give, but I can offer something else. I can offer knowledge. I can teach anyone who wishes to learn. I can show you how to read the signs that nature provides, how to preserve food against lean times, how to dig cellars that will keep your families alive when the world above tries to kill them. This is what Bridget would have wanted. This is what I can do." He sat down. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Reverend Blackwood rose from his pew and walked to the back of the church. He extended his hand. "Will you teach me?" he asked. His voice was thick with emotion, but there was something new in it, something like hope. Levi looked at the offered hand, then at the man who offered it. He thought of Bridget, of her last words spoken in Irish, of the Celtic knot carved above his cellar door. Slowly, deliberately, he reached out and clasped the Reverend's hand. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "bring a notebook and a willingness to listen." The spring that followed the Great White Death was unlike any spring Dusty Fork had known. The snow melted slowly, releasing its grip on the land with reluctance, as if hesitant to reveal the damage it had caused. But as the brown grass emerged and the creeks began to flow again, something else emerged as well. A community transformed by catastrophe and taught by a man they had once called the Mole Man. Levi's teaching sessions continued through March and April and into May. What had begun as emergency instruction during the blizzard became something more structured, more deliberate. He taught canning and smoking and pickling to anyone who would learn. He taught the art of reading weather signs, the thickness of onion skins, the behavior of animals, the color of sunset clouds. He taught cellar construction, drawing diagrams in the dirt outside his hillside home, while students took careful notes. If this epilogue is touching your heart, share this video with friends who believe in the power of preparation and community. Your engagement helps more people discover these meaningful stories. And the cellars began to multiply. The first was dug by Carlton, the feed store owner, on a south-facing slope behind his property. He excavated it to 20 feet, not as deep as Levi's 30, but deeper than any standard cellar in the territory, and lined it with mortared stone according to Levi's specifications. When it was finished, Levi inspected it personally and pronounced it sound. The second was dug by a group of 5 families working together, pooling resources and labor to create a communal storage space that could serve them all. They called it the Unity Cellar, a name that caught Levi's attention when he heard it, though he said nothing. By the end of the first summer, 12 cellars had been completed. By the end of the second year, 47. The technique spread beyond Dusty Fork, as travelers carried stories of the blizzard and the man who had saved an entire town with nothing more than a hole in the ground. Building like Callaway became a phrase in the Wyoming Territory, and then in Colorado and Montana and Nebraska, a way of describing thorough preparation that anticipated worst-case scenarios rather than trusting to luck and providence. The phrase mole man transformed as well. Where it had once been a term of derision, it became something like an honorific. That fellow builds like a mole man, people would say, and they meant it as the highest compliment, meaning one who plans when others mock, who digs when others build steeples, who survives when others perish. Reverend Blackwood became Levi's most dedicated student. The irony was not lost on either man, but neither spoke of it directly. The Reverend arrived at the hillside every Tuesday morning for 3 years, taking notes in a leather-bound journal, asking questions that revealed genuine curiosity rather than performative humility. His sermons changed. Where he had once preached about building toward heaven, he now preached about serving one's neighbors in practical ways. The steeple was never rebuilt. Hickory, the chestnut mare who had shared Levi's cellar through the 19 days of blizzard, lived another 8 years. She died in the spring of 1895, quietly, lying down in the small pasture behind the cabin and simply not rising again. Levi buried her himself, digging the grave with the same pick he had used to excavate the cellar. He placed her next to a wild apple tree whose fruit had provided vinegar for Bridget's pickles, and he marked the grave with a simple stone bearing no inscription. Some things needed no words. Levi himself lived until the autumn of 1912, passing away at 81 years of age in the cellar that had become both his home and his legacy. Martha Blackwood found him there, sitting in his chair beside the rows of provisions that he still maintained despite his advanced years, looking for all the world as though he had simply fallen asleep. In his lap was the leather journal containing Bridget's teachings, open to the page where he had recorded her final words in both English and Irish. By that time, over 200 Callaway cellars dotted the Wyoming Territory and the surrounding states. The technique had spread as far as Canada and Mexico, carried by settlers who had heard the story of the blizzard and the mole man and understood that wisdom was worth more than pride. A regional newspaper calculated that the preparation methods Levi had taught had saved an estimated 3,000 lives over the 4 decades since the Great White Death, families who had survived blizzards and famines and droughts because they had listened to a man who learned from a woman who survived worse. The funeral was held in the rebuilt church, and it overflowed with mourners. Reverend Blackwood, now elderly himself, delivered the eulogy. He spoke of sin and redemption, of mockery and forgiveness, of a man who had every reason to turn away from a community that had shunned him and instead chose to teach them everything he knew. He wept openly as he spoke, and no one thought less of him for it. 3 days before he died, Levi had called Carlton and 2 other men to his cellar. He showed them a carving he had been working on for months, a tablet of polished stone meant to be mounted above the cellar entrance. The inscription was in two languages, English and Irish, just as Bridget would have wanted. Ni nert go cur le shele. There is no strength without unity. The men mounted it where Levi indicated, replacing the Celtic knot he had carved decades earlier. When they finished, Levi stood looking at it for a long time. "My grandmother would be pleased," he said finally. It was one of the last things he ever spoke. Like and subscribe for more stories of wisdom passed down through generations, proving that what we build together outlasts what we build alone. The Cellar still stands. More than a century after Levi Calloway first broke ground on the hillside that everyone called a folly, the stone walls remain solid, the drainage still works perfectly, and the temperature holds steady at 55 degrees, regardless of what the Wyoming weather does above. The Historical Society has preserved it, installing a small museum near the entrance that tells the story of the Great White Death and the man who survived it by listening to his grandmother. Visitors come from across the country to see the place where one man's preparation saved a town. They read the inscription above the door. They walk down the stone steps into the cool darkness where 900 pounds of smoked beef and 600 jars of preserved vegetables once lined the walls. They stand where Levi stood, where hickory once waited out a blizzard, where Bridget's wisdom found its final and most perfect expression. And if they are quiet, if they listen carefully, they can almost hear an old man's voice explaining the proper ratio of salt to meat, the ideal depth for a cellar in rocky soil, the signs in nature that predict severe weather. They can almost see a gray-bearded figure standing before a classroom of eager students, passing on knowledge that had been paid for in blood and hunger generations before any of them were born. Above the entrance, the inscription gleams in whatever light finds its way down the hillside. Ni nert go cur le chele. There is no strength without unity. The words Bridget spoke in County Mayo. The words she whispered on her deathbed in Nebraska. The words her grandson carried to Wyoming and taught to a town that had mocked him for his preparations. Bridget would have recognized those words. She would have understood why her grandson chose them for his final monument, why he carved them in her language as well as his. She would have been proud of the boy she raised, the man he became, the lives he saved, and the knowledge he passed forward to generations who would face their own blizzards and famines and catastrophes. She would have recognized, too, the final truth her grandson understood, that survival alone is never enough. That what matters is what you teach, what you share, what you build together with others. That there is no strength without unity, and no legacy without love, and no wisdom worth having that is not freely given to those who will carry it forward into the uncertain future. The cellar still stands. The inscription endures. And somewhere, in the great beyond that lies past the veil of this mortal life, a woman who survived the Irish famine smiles at the grandson who remembered everything she taught him and passed it on to a world that desperately needed to learn.